All right.
All right, I'm going to get started. Welcome to our weekly webinar series, everyone. We're going to get going right now. So, for those of you who uh, might not know who we are Crow Canyon, a nonprofit in Southwest Colorado, an archaeological nonprofit. You can learn more about us at our website, crowcanyon.org. I'm getting ready to give you a lot of information about a lot of different things, but just rest assured, anything that you miss, any QR code or anything like that, if you miss it, you can find it on our website at crowcanyon.org. So that's really the main thing that you need to know. Um, I know a lot of us are kind of old hands at the kind of Zoom webinars now. I just want to reiterate that if you have any questions, please be sure to put it in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A. Okay? We used to do things on Facebook Live. We do not do them anymore. So that's another thing to think about. But if for any reason you have technical difficulties, this talk will be posted on YouTube. I want to start off by giving a land acknowledgement. So the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache, people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work we are doing here at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold as a result of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities. With gratitude, we honor the contribution of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and colleagues with whom we partner, who have helped guide our work and our mission. We just want to bring, really warm welcome to our 2025 CRM Field School. They just started this week, and we are just really lucky to have them and excited to have them on campus. It's been pretty cool to see so many people here on campus. I just want to highlight some actual trips that we do through our cultural explorations programs here at Crow Canyon. We have a number of different kind of excursions coming up, and here are the dates and kind of subjects for each one. If you want to find out more, there's that QR code right there. You can kind of scan it. I'll leave it here for a quick beat, and then I will move on. Um, We are so close to meeting one of our fundraising goals that has a 50 up to $50,000 match by the Greenlee Foundation. So currently we're at $47,205. So if you want to learn more about how to support us here and maybe we can meet this match, you can scan the QR code here. I'm definitely going to leave it here for a beat. Okay. Our upcoming webinar events. So we just want to make a quick announcement that there's not a webinar next week, so July 10th. There's also not a webinar on July 31st. So the next webinar will be on July 17th, and it'll actually be a film showing, a film with Lyle Belanqua and Craig Childs. As a film made by our very own Laura Brown. So definitely give that a look. And then the following one will be a poetry reading with Laguna Pueblo poet Max Early, and that's on July 24th. We also just want to say that our webinar series wouldn't be possible without our late and dear friend and colleague, Taylor. If you want to learn more about how to support this webinar series, you can scan this QR code here, and I'll definitely leave this up for a beat. Three, two, one. Okay. Now let's introduce our webinar speaker this week. So our webinar speaker is Jewel Cummins. Jewel is a PhD candidate in American Indian Studies, minoring in information at the University of Arizona. She's a graduate research associate with the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, providing an information science perspective on projects involving repository development, creation of template agreements, and curriculum development, among many other things. So please welcome Jewel, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I want to start by thanking the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, as well as Benjamin and Jonathan specifically for hosting this wonderful series and for having me. My name is Jewel Cummins. I'm a settler and an ally, and I'm going to be talking today about the importance of information professionals in research, from project development to the repository. I am speaking with you from Tucson on the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham. I also want to acknowledge the Yaqui. And so today I will be starting by setting the stage, which will be giving my positionality. I will move into laying the foundations and providing some definitions and explanations. Then, in order to make the connections to show why research teams need an archivist, and then finally, I'll be bringing it home, showing Indigenous perspectives in information training, as well as providing some recommendations for you. And so to start by setting the stage, I will be providing my positionality, my relational position, which is my background, both personally and professionally. So I am a firm believer in tell me who you are before you tell me what you know. And I first heard this from Dr. Lydia Jennings at Dartmouth. So this begins the conversation by letting you all know who I am and the why for why I sought out particular experience within relationships, as well as my professional and academic experience. So I am born and raised in Michigan. On this map, it is the southwest corner of the Mitten in Kalamazoo Township, just above the township name. You will see the city of Portage. And yes, I hold up my hand, but I hold up the wrong one. So it's ironic. I have also lived in Wisconsin. I have one brother and his family, as well as my best friend and her family that are in Michigan still. I have another brother and his family, as well as my father and stepmother and her family are all in Wisconsin as well. But I've been in Tucson, Arizona for more than a decade, and I will freely admit that I acclimated to the heat very quickly. So like I said, I have two brothers. They both have very large families, multiple children, but my only child is that goofy Muppet that you see in this picture. His name is Samson. Hopefully it makes you smile just a little bit. And so transitioning into my educational background, I have attended quite a few colleges, although I've been at the University of Arizona the longest. I hold an associate's in criminal justice from Kalamazoo Valley Community College. I also hold a bachelor's in political science from Kalamazoo College. Sorry, Google just signed me out. I also hold a post-degree paralegal certificate from Pima Community College in Arizona. And then from the University of Arizona, I have a Master's of Legal Studies with an Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy concentration. I also have a Master's of Library and Information Sciences with an archival certificate. And as mentioned, I am a third year going into my fourth PhD candidate in American Indian Studies, minoring in information or specifically archives. I won't go into my dissertation work now because I'm going to be covering that just a little bit later. So in a professional capacity, I am a graduate research associate, or GRA, with the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. I have been a part of the collab since I interned for my Master's of Library and Information Sciences degree more than 3 years ago. As part of my collab duties, I have had the opportunity to work on a variety of projects in multiple disciplines, particularly as one of the only, if not the only, information sciences person in the group. I will be providing greater detail about the projects I've worked on or are currently working in or in past. But for now, it is important to note that the collab has provided me with invaluable experience and relationships. In addition to being a GRA, I started a fellowship last month that with the United Methodist Church and 3 other affiliated organizations to investigate the United Methodist Churches, or UMC's, involvement and history with Indian boarding schools. I am also currently an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University, teaching in applied Indigenous studies. I have also taught at Pima Community College in American Indian Studies. However, I stepped away from that for my final year of my dissertation. Finally, I was first an intern and then a contractor with Labriola National American Indian Data Center at Arizona State University, working to apply the protocols for Native American archival materials to their archival collections. I will also be diving into that work later. So as I move through the webinar, you will see that within all of these positions, there is an intentionality of building relationships and gaining particular experience. So in this next section, I'm going to be laying the foundation, providing definitions and explanations of terms and training in the different disciplines and fields I have education and experience in. To start with, we're going to look at Indigenous Data Sovereignty, which I have experience with my GRA position. Indigenous Data Sovereignty, or IDSov, is the right of Indigenous peoples and tribal nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data, from collection and storage to use and reuse. IDSov is founded in inherent sovereignty, with only Indigenous peoples and tribal nations as rights holders able to exercise it. IDSov is a responsibility and expression of the ways, traditions, and roles that communities have for the care and use of their knowledge. Positioned within a human rights framework, IDSov leverages policies, protocols, memorandums of understandings, agreements and contracts, and Indigenous and tribal laws, codes, and legislation, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also known as UNDRIP. IDSov underscores that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who they are as Indigenous peoples. It is important to acknowledge that the term Indigenous data sovereignty is very different from mainstream data sovereignty, which is the concept that information which has been converted and stored in binary digital form is subject to the laws of the country in which it is located, making it largely geographically bound and involving digital information. IDSov expands beyond these to allow persistent relationships across time and space. Underpinning IDSov is the reciprocal relationship of governance of data and data for governance. Governance of data encompasses ownership and the mechanisms Indigenous peoples and tribal nations or communities need to honor, protect, and control their information, both internally and externally. Data for governance is a matter of quality, access, relevance, and the need Indigenous peoples and tribal nations or communities have for accurate, relevant, and timely data for policy and decision-making. With data critical for the exercise of Indigenous or tribal sovereignty, Indigenous peoples and tribal nations require data for governance and self-determined decision-making. Through the activation of IDSov, Indigenous peoples and tribal nations replace external, non-tribal norms and priorities with tribal systems that define data, control how it is collected, and influence how it is used. It results in findings derived both from the external data collected on Indigenous peoples and from internal data produced by Native nations that reflect the understandings of those peoples. At the same time, Indigenous peoples and tribal nations, like many other governments and institutions, create and enact data policies and practices that align with their values and knowledge systems. Within this context, Indigenous Data Governance, or IDGov, is the means of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. By using IDGov mechanisms, Indigenous peoples and tribal nations are rebuilding their governance systems while also reclaiming their data. Over the past almost 10 years, there has been scholarship, including the open access books Indigenous Data Sovereignty Toward an Agenda in 2016 and Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy in 2020, as well as frameworks and principles for Indigenous data governance at various levels, including the international level. There are examples of principles, protocols, and mechanisms in Canada, Asia, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, US, and by Sami Council, which is an NGO working across Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And some of these protocols and policies and mechanisms have international reach. One of these frameworks are the CARE principles. They were developed in 2018 and published in 2019. They are an IDSov there was an IDSov Indigenous-led workshop that was held in Botswana, at which Indigenous and allied academics and practitioners convened to draft these IDGov principles. Using frameworks, principles, and governance networks to inform dialogue, workshop attendees developed the CARE principles and their sub-principles after debate and feedback over the course of several months. As an Indigenous framework emphasizing people and purpose-oriented principles, the CARE principles are designed to complement the FAIR guiding principles, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. FAIR is more data-centric, focusing on the attributes of data objects themselves, whereas the CARE principles focus on the people relating to the data and the purpose for which the data are collected, used, and analyzed. Through their complementary application, the CARE and FAIR principles guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data processes that strengthen Indigenous control for improved discovery, access, use, reuse, and attribution in contemporary landscapes. It is important to note that although the CARE principles are conceptually distinct, they are related to each other to define interest, rights, and concepts to facilitate Indigenous peoples' control in data governance. Each of the main principles of CARE have 3 sub-principles. It is not my intent to read what is on the screen, but for those looking for more information about the CARE principles, you can go to gita-global.org. There is a handout that expands and explains each of the main principles and sub-principles of CARE. I want to reiterate, however, that the CARE principles are a people and purpose-centered framework that direct people back to their community, to local, regional, and nation-state IDSov definitions and frameworks, with the goal of effective CARE implementation requiring the establishing of data governance mechanisms, incorporating IDSov and IDGov principles, frameworks, and mechanisms. CARE emphasizes the prioritization of these local, regional, and nation-state frameworks. As stated in the forthcoming Gita communique, for Indigenous communities without specific data governance mechanisms and sovereignty principles, they may look to the CARE principles and the CARE data maturity model as a framework for guidance. For more information on the CARE data maturity model, please go to the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance website under What We Do. In addition to IDSov, IDGov, and the CARE principles, I also want to provide a high-level overview of the training those that have completed library and information sciences training or degree programs have. I might shorten it to LIS just so you know. For those that are not familiar with the term, the description of the master's program at UA states, accredited by the American Library Association, it reflects the diversity of library and information environments, covering an array of professional perspectives, from archival studies to digital curation, from public librarianship to legal information, and from health informatics to academic librarianship. UA's MLIS program also has, or Masters of Library and Information Sciences program, also has the Knowledge River Scholars Program, which specializes in educating library and information professionals through professional development and practical experience. The KR program cultivates understanding of library and information challenges and respect for vernacular language, and it supports preservation and access to a range of information, data, and cultural heritage resources. Unfortunately, I did not know about the KR program until my last year, most likely due to I was in my master's program during COVID. So moving back into a higher level view of LIS training, there are a few important pieces to note. From a Western perspective, information institutions are generally classified as either libraries, archives, museums, etc. Libraries are publicly accessible brick-and-mortar institutions that generally curate books, newspapers, if they're still accessible, and digital resources. Community members can also access the internet on public computers. Archives, in contrast, are more often used for historical research by those that are comfortable using them, even if they can be accessed by the public. Archives focus on preservation and conservation of primary resources and are generally focused on particular collection parameters. So, for example, they may only collect information or data from a particular region or within a particular discipline. Although these definitions of libraries and archives are becoming increasingly blurred, such as with the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, which has both archival and library collections, there remains the question within LIS. Where are Indigenous perspectives, knowledges, or experience with Indigenous data within LIS training? One answer are the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, or PNAM. These were developed in 2006 by Native American and non-Indigenous archivists, librarians, anthropologists, and historians. These 10 guidelines or best practices provide recommendations to archives and libraries, and 6 out of 10 provide recommendations to Native American communities. PNAM, which I will also discuss later, is one of the only ways Indigenous perspectives was brought into my LIS curriculum. Another aspect was in relation to community-driven archives, which are defined as materials generated by not-for-profit and non-governmental entities, often a particular group or community sharing common interests, whether that's origins, geography, ethnicities, lifestyles, or other factors. Community archives are often independent grassroots organizations, and they usually rely on active participation of the community in documenting and making accessible the history of their particular group and/or locality on their own terms. There are several examples of Indigenous community-driven archives. So now that I have provided some definitions and explanations, in making the connections, I will show how my experience in IDSov has provided me with important experience in Indigenous perspectives, particularly when looking at LIS, and how that has translated into the other projects and work that I do. So first is the revitalization of American Indian food systems, enhancing Indigenous climate-smart seed biodiversity, native foodways preservation, and Indigenous data governance. Hence why I didn't put the entire title on the slide, which is a Rockefeller Foundation-funded project. This project has 4 branches or work areas, 3 of which I am a part of. The first involves seed repository cataloging and guidelines. During this part of the project, I, as well as others, have conducted an evaluation of current non-tribal and university-affiliated repository practices. We created the Indigenous Seed Survey, the goal of which was to build understanding of the scope of Indigenous seed holdings in non-tribal and university-affiliated repositories. This survey was sent to 85 institutions, compiled through independent research and with conversations with a former Crow Canyon Archaeological Center employee. Along with the survey, we sent a letter explaining or providing an overview of the project's research goals. We solicited responses to the following types of questions. Are there any plant specimens in your collections sourced from Indigenous communities, including seeds and plant parts, burned or unburned? Do you have these specimens digitally cataloged or a way to search for these specimens? Do you have specific care and management protocols in place for these specimens? Does your institution have protocols for research or descendant community access to these specimens or experience with this in the past? I was brought in for the development of the survey for both the LIS and the IDSov perspective. The survey had 32 responses ranging from partial to complete. And of the institutions that sent documents in response to the survey questions, I, along with Charlotte Grace Dawson, a Ph.D. candidate in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona, and Noah Schlager, a Ph.D. student in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona, we coded the documents based off of the following categories: sovereignty, accessibility, transparency, and oversight. As with the survey development, I was able to bring in my perspective and experience with both LIS and IDSov during the coding. Although both of the other graduate students had experience with seeds and plant materials, their preservation, and in-field collecting, I was able to explain the likely real-world and practical implications of the institution's policies and protocols. The second branch of the project is the data governance model and seed repository development, aka Repository Hub. I want to acknowledge the work of Moe's policy scholar, Cara Buchanan, an undergraduate mentee that did much of the heavy lifting of compiling resources, templates, information, etc. Work within this category includes a compilation of a spreadsheet of open access resources involving seeds and Indigenous or tribal environmental policies. The spreadsheet is currently at a couple hundred rows. And this spreadsheet will join first an Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Ethics resource inventory sheet created as part of another project at the Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Lab and consisting of various publications, training materials, etc. And the second is a compilation of various tribal legislation, regulations, protocols, and policies compiled through another project. In addition to the compilation of these resources and information, I have also been working on drafting what we call living documents for this repository hub, including a data equity policy and data sharing policy, Indigenous Data Sovereignty statement, mission and vision statements, collections policy, and finally, review, funding, and repermissioning statements. Finally, I have been investigating also possible software, platforms, etc., to use within this repository hub and creating explanations for those that are on the project but outside of the LIS field. The final piece of the Rockefeller project I am a part of is the creation of 4 process document templates. First is a memorandum of understanding where one party in the relationship is an Indigenous party. Second is a memorandum of agreement, also where one of the signees is an Indigenous party. An intellectual property agreement between funders and awardees when the project involves Indigenous data. And finally, a data sharing agreement where one party or more is an Indigenous party. These 4 process documents amount to more than 50 pages. Each will include a top tearaway sheet with brief explanations of when and how the particular process document may be used. Each process document will also include explanations of each section, prompts for conversations between parties or others, examples of language, and some model language if users desire to use it. Finally, each process document will have a user-friendly blank template that Indigenous peoples, tribal users, and others can use if they would like. Another project that I led as part of my GRA work was 2 archives webinars in April 2025. The first was Why Research Teams Need an Archivist, which was from an international perspective and featured Tracy Maniapoto, Kirsten Thorpe, and Rose Barrowcliff. The other webinar was The Right to Know, Connecting Indigenous Librarianship to Cultural Sovereignty from a U.S. perspective, and it featured Alexander Soto and Vina Begay from the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, as well as myself. Each of these webinars has an associated resource list curated by myself and the speakers, and is available on the webpage you see on the screen. Although distinct, these webinars looked at related aspects of the ways in which information professionals like myself can help research projects. A policy brief is currently being developed to synthesize the topics from both of the webinars. For those who do not know or are not familiar with them, policy briefs are an excellent way to get information out in a shortened or condensed format and timeline. Briefs are generally 2 to 3 pages, although that is just a guideline. And although they are not peer-reviewed based off of journal guidelines, policy briefs are reviewed by collaborators and allies and provide a faster way to get information to those needing it or to whom it will be useful. So the Archives policy brief will draw on the topics and examples discussed within these webinars, along with recommendations for actions for those looking to include information professionals within their projects. Some of those recommendations I've included at the end of this. In addition to the Archives webinars, I was also part of a series of approximately 4 webinars that were put forth on various topics for Indigenous peoples and tribal nations. These webinars were hosted by the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network and the Indigenous Peoples Data Collective. For those unfamiliar with it, the Indigenous Peoples Data Collective, or IPDC, convenes Indigenous peoples and tribal nations with U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network partners, which are listed on the screen, to craft specific, locally relevant law, policy, and infrastructure strategies for implementing IDSov and IDGov. In the bulk of these webinars, my main role as a non-Indigenous individual was support. It was to note take or just listen, depending on whether the webinar called for a quote-unquote pens down format, and to provide internal and/or external short summaries written with others for what each webinar covered, its goals, and a high-level overview of participants. One of the pens down IPDC webinars was Agreements and MOUs as Strategic Tools for Indigenous Data Governance for Indigenous Peoples and Tribal Nations. This was put on by Jane Anderson, Stephanie Rousseau-Carroll, Desi Small-Rodriguez, myself, Melissa Flemond, Andrew Martinez, and Vanessa Smith. At this webinar, we presented the elements of an Indigenous Data Governance or IDGov bundle, which presented 4 mechanisms for Indigenous peoples and tribal nations to use for the promotion of their sovereignty. We gave examples in each of the 4 areas: policies and protocols, memorandums of understanding, agreements and contract, which includes licensing, and Indigenous and tribal legal code, law, or legislation. With my background in LIS, I presented on PNAM as an example for protocols. A policy brief is also being written of the information and that was presented in regards to the IDGov bundle. The hope is that the brief will be done with updated figures and images in the next several months. In this policy brief, explanations will be provided for each of the previously stated bundle mechanisms. Like the Archives webinar series, an open access resource list will also be linked with various resources, examples, and templates of the 4 types of mechanisms. For example, we hope to have the 4 process document templates from the Rockefeller Project linked to this list. So shifting away from my graduate research assistant or associate, or my GRA work, I would also like to discuss some of my dissertation work. So the larger project is currently titled Promoting Healing Through Archives, Connecting Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Governance with Indian Boarding School Records, and it will be a series of at least 3 peer-reviewed articles. So the overarching goal of my dissertation is the promotion of Indigenous peoples' rights to their data, specifically those documenting Indian boarding school experiences. Other goals of the project include: first, evaluate institutional or organizational policies and protocols to identify gaps in management and stewardship of Indigenous data, particularly Indian boarding school data. Second, evaluate answers to questions such as what records exist at the particular institution or organization of Indian boarding schools, how are these records described, and who controls them. Third, bring the information and analysis to the Indigenous peoples who produced or are involved in the data so new practices and policies can be promoted and implemented through relationship building. And finally, aid in Indigenous community discoverability and control of their data and information, again, specifically pertaining to Indian boarding school records, as well as promote IDSov and IDGov principles, protocols, and practices. The promotion of this potentially includes the development of or use of the IDGov mechanisms previously mentioned. My 4 research aims also promote these goals, but allow for flexibility depending on current climate, funding, and community needs or wants. And prior to beginning my dissertation, I needed to have several honest, open, and quite frankly, candid conversations about the appropriate way for me to approach the subject as an ally, as a settler. These steps I could or should not take, and how to conduct the work in the best way possible in relationship with the Indigenous communities I am responsible to, given I will likely be coming across their data. These conversations occurred not just within myself, but also with my Ph.D. committee members, Collaboratory members, and other students as I figured out the best way for me to articulate my relationality. It wasn't always easy, but it shouldn't be. From these conversations and internal musings, I have developed a relationality statement. Some might call it a positionality statement. This statement explains what I quote unquote bring to the work and who I am responsible to. A very much shortened version of my relationality statement is as follows. As a settler and an ally, it is not uncommon for one of the first questions I am asked to be about why I believe I am the right person to do the work at the intersection of IDSov or IDGov, archives, and Indian boarding schools and their records? This is a valid question and one that I am constantly reflecting on. Academically, I am trained in the Western fields of library and information sciences and law, but I have made an intentional effort to incorporate Indigenous perspectives through concentrations, internships, and my work. My relationships have shaped me to understand how vital relationships are to the work that I do and tearing down the walls that are often and incorrectly erected between disciplines and practices. I am responsible to the Indigenous peoples, communities, and individuals that I partner or collaborate with, as well as those that are represented in my work. It is my honor and responsibility to advocate for those that may either no longer be able to advocate for themselves or those that are unfamiliar with the Western information practices currently governing their data. I hope to show how it is the ethical responsibility of non-Indigenous information professionals to be transparent in the work that they do to promote Indigenous peoples' rights in Western institutions. One final piece of my dissertation that I would like to address is a piece that actually evolved naturally from the other work that I do, such as the archives webinars, as well as the initial stages of my dissertation, including the development of my relationality statement. And it is a comparison of PNAM and the CARE principles. As previously stated, the CARE principles direct people back to their community, to local, regional, and nation-state IDSov definitions and frameworks. This includes policies and protocols such as PNAM, which were created about a decade prior to the CARE principles. As part of my dissertation work, I am making the argument that CARE expands and augments PNAM, and to show this, I created a comparison of CARE and its sub-principles with PNAM's guidelines. This is an example of the current iteration, and yes, I have a comparison of just the main principles of CARE with PNAM. The original iteration of these connections is actually too large to fit on a slide because I included text and explanations of each of the principles, sub-principles, and guidelines. It is, quite frankly, a chaotic, beautiful mess. On this slide, you will see that the sub-principles of collective benefit on the left are connecting with the 10 guidelines from PNAM on the right. Here's another visual for the comparison in which CARE and its sub-principles are across the top in columns, and the 10 PNAM guidelines are listed in the rows. The totals are to show how many connections there are. So for example, the main principle of CARE, which is collective benefit, has 6 connections with PNAM, and the first guideline of PNAM, which is building relationships of mutual respect, connects to 10 different CARE principles and sub-principles. For the comparison, my experience with IDSov as well as LIS has provided me with the knowledge and experience to think about the similarities between CARE and PNAM, as well as to consider gaps and expansions. For example, whereas PNAM specifically applies to Native Americans, CARE applies to all Indigenous peoples' data. Another example is that not all of PNAM's recommendations include recommendations for Native American communities. However, CARE provides guidance in these gaps if it's needed. Finally, PNAM encompasses libraries and archives, but CARE implicates all repositories, regardless of classification, that steward Indigenous data. So in addition to my GRA and my dissertation work, I want to look at 2 other pieces of work or former work, which is first my fellowship and second my work at Labriola. So my fellowship, titled History of the United Methodist Church and Indigenous Boarding Schools, I'm very excited and honored to be working on this, as it's almost directly related to my dissertation project, just bounded differently. So for example, my dissertation is geographically bound to the Southwest and to non-mission schools. This fellowship, in contrast, is Methodist, so obviously religion, and it's affiliated denomination schools, but it's also across the US. And my part in this fellowship is actually during the end of the second and moving into the third phase of an ongoing project. I will be conducting extensive archival research into the UMC and its antecedent denominations' involvement in at least 5 identified Methodist-related Indigenous boarding schools. My duties will include updating the list of known or identified boarding schools as needed, analyzing historical materials to examine the policies, practices, and theological underpinnings of these institutions, and engaging with Indigenous communities, oral histories, and primary sources to integrate Indigenous perspectives. Throughout the process, I will be collaborating with academic advisors, Indigenous leaders, as well as historians. The same relationality or positionality and set of skills I am using in my dissertation and GRA work to promote Indigenous rights are the skills that I will use within my fellowship. The other work I have done that is important to acknowledge is with the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, also known as Labriola. Beginning as an intern, then moving into a contractor position, my main duty was the application of PNAM to archival collections. To provide a bit of background for those that are unfamiliar with it, Labriola was established in 1993, and it is an Indigenous library within the larger Arizona State University library system. Prior to Labriola being founded, any archival collection holding Indigenous data was deposited into the Greater Arizona Collections Repository at ASU. After identification by the Greater Arizona Collections curator, Renee James, of the top 10 priorities for PNAM review, I got to work. During the review process, I was identifying items that needed to be culturally restricted, but also performing reparative descriptions. These reparative descriptions ranged from properly identifying an Indigenous community to changing a description from school children standing on steps to Native American school children standing on steps. Finally, I was also able to help process a couple of collections. This was an amazing experience because whereas from a Western framework, an archival collection will be arranged usually based on media type, for example, newspapers are all together, photographs are all together, etc. We worked on arranging the collections based on a storytelling method. Therefore, the major events in this person's life were noted actually on 3x5 cards and Post-its and stuck to the wall, and all the information about these main events were kept together. This collection therefore chronicled this person's life. Her name was Jean Shahadri, and unbeknownst to me at the time, she actually advocated for and succeeded in the preservation of the Phoenix Indian School grounds, which is an Indian boarding school, obviously in Phoenix, Arizona. And so, bringing it home, I'll provide a high-level overview of some aspects of what the quote-unquote appropriate training looks like for a non-Indigenous LIS professional and why this training is important as an influence as well as providing valuable insight into or for research. I will end with some recommendations. So although not an all-inclusive list, proper training includes familiarity with appropriate perspectives and relationality. This includes the incorporation of Indigenous perspectives and within historically, quote-unquote, Western disciplines or fields, where knowledge and data tend to be siloed or disconnected from other knowledges. Bringing in Indigenous perspectives and relationality reconnects these knowledges to provide a more holistic and relational view of data. Another aspect of appropriate perspectives includes training and familiarity with Indigenous cultural protocols. There is obviously no way to know the appropriate cultural protocols for every Indigenous community within the U.S., let alone the world, but understanding general rules and flags to pay attention to is valuable. Another area proper training includes is knowledge, meaning knowledge to promote Indigenous peoples' rights within different projects, project stages, and contexts. This includes everything from ensuring Indigenous rights are promoted or protected during collection and data sharing to descriptive practices. And like including Indigenous perspectives and relationality, appropriate knowledge will help to promote Indigenous peoples' rights, which could be the prioritization of Indigenous authors, Indigenous scholars, and Indigenous-led projects through relationship building and support. Another aspect of knowledge and promotion of Indigenous peoples' rights within a project is how to appropriately acknowledge and cite Indigenous knowledges. Based on Western definitions of quote-unquote primary sources and appropriate citation practices, it is not always easy to identify Indigenous knowledge or cite them, such as stories, elder knowledge, etc. A properly trained LIS professional will be able to help with these citations as well as their inclusion. One final area I want to touch on for proper training is understanding. Within this area, one of the most important pieces is understanding of space and place. One of the most impactful conversations I have had was with Dr. Jane Anderson, the founder of Local Context, who is also a settler and an ally. She said, "You should always be expected to leave the room when in Indigenous spaces." This is important for non-Indigenous LIS professionals to understand, is that despite our knowledge, despite perhaps believing or knowing that we could quote unquote help to promote Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous sovereignty, it is not always the correct space or place for us to be. We need to act with grace when this happens. Finally, understanding includes translation. As someone who works in both IDSov and LIS spaces, I have been called upon to translate different principles, concepts, or ideas when in relationship with different audiences. For example, explaining the importance of applying PNAM to collections holding Indigenous data is different when speaking with an Indigenous audience with no LIS background versus LIS professionals. So to help navigate or discover whether someone has the appropriate training, you can ask yourself the following. Does the LIS professional have a history or track record of work with Indigenous peoples or communities, scholars, such as co-authors, collaborators, etc.? Have they attended cultural sensitivity training or the equivalent? Does the LIS professional have a relationality or positionality statement, whatever they call it, to indicate their priorities and how they operate? Think of some of the information I provided in mine. So in conjunction with these prompts, here are just a few recommendations, and I want to start them by acknowledging that, of course, including an Indigenous information professional is always the first choice, but it isn't always an option, and that's where these prompts and recommendations come in. So you can consult or include an appropriately trained LIS professional during the project development and or prior to any data collection. You can consult or include an appropriately trained LIS professional for literature review or searching of sources, or even in general information. You can consult or include an LIS professional in the application process, such as for grants or research applications. So with an Indigenous or appropriately trained LIS professional as part of your research team, or even part of your consultation network, you prevent issues down the road. This includes violations of cultural sensitivity, restrictions, identity, naming, labels, citations, the list goes on. But most importantly, my biggest recommendation is to have the conversation. I have never met an LIS professional who didn't want to have a conversation, provide resources, thoughts, and general recommendations for paths forward. So even if they may not have all the answers, we are generally pretty good about finding them. So again, thank you. And I want to thank the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or for a chat. And you see my email on the screen. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic, Jewel. Thank you so much. So we've got some questions rolling in, and I'll start with the first one if you're ready.
Yep, I'm
Yeah.
ready.
One of the things that one of our attendees asked is, for you were talking about the project about like seed banks and things and repositories like that, kind of the surveys. Did you send any of the surveys to Native Seed Search in Tucson, Arizona?
I don't believe so. I was not the one that was in charge of actually sending out the surveys, but I don't believe so. No, I'm thinking of all of the different repositories that we coded documents for, and that
Hmm.
name does not ring a bell. So
Okay,
the bulk of the end result analysis is basically from university affiliated and repositories, mostly museums.
gotcha. That Native Seed Search is really interesting in that way because they commercially sell, right, these kinds of seeds. So I always think about that in terms of ethics. It's it's a
Yes.
really good thing, and then also, there's this push and pull. So I see what they're trying to do, and again, I think it's important, but
I
yeah.
will say that 100%. they came up in conversations during
Oh yeah.
between the three of us grad students, because
Uh-huh.
I did not have experience with them, but two of the other grad students did. And so it
Right.
was interesting how they came up within conversations. But regarding the survey, no, I don't believe we did.
I see. I really appreciated your like all the recommendations for training and things like that. A lot of my questions surround that. Um, and so when when you're developing your positionality or relationality kind of statements and things, is there just kind of any practical advice that you have for burgeoning information professionals on, or are there any are there any conversations that were really good to have with, like, say, your committee or anything like that, or any advice?
It the understanding that it's going to be uncomfortable
Yeah.
was probably the biggest thing that I can give to people when they're crafting it,
Yeah.
especially when you're doing it correctly. Because it's very easy to say, I'm a settler and an ally and blah, 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 right? But understanding beyond that and what that means, like I said, can be very uncomfortable. And almost all of my committee is Indigenous.
Mm,
And so in discussions with them, under them even coming to me and saying, look, if you approach me in this way with this data, I wouldn't be happy, right?
mm,
Even having those kinds of conversations, again, are very difficult, but they were so valuable for crafting that statement
yeah.
and understanding the larger picture of what is appropriate and inappropriate for me to do.
Right. It's really interesting how you're talking about this kind of like process, right? I mean, like developing this with people. At the end of the day, you have to uh, state goals and
Yeah.
priorities, right? So like you
Yep.
have to put yourself out there and say, this is what I'm trying to do. And that's vulnerable, right? Because
Yeah.
in you could be wrong in the future, right? But hindsight being 2020. So it's engaging with uncomfortability, I guess, is really
Yes.
good advice. And we're in archaeology, we're having these kinds of discussions right now, and we're working with indigenous communities and scholars and archaeologists, and, like going, say, as like an academic or a tenure track professor, going into that relationship, just pretending, and like you said, easily saying like I'm an ally.
Right.
The people are going to look at you and go, and like, what are you getting out of this? What are your goals? Like,
Yeah.
don't treat us like as if we don't know. So,
Well, and I've also had the response of, and this was in conversation with people that know me,
mm,
but one of their favorite phrases is prove it. You
yeah,
said you're an ally, prove it. Are
right,
you actually walking your talk? So
yeah,
looking at, like I recommended, collaborators and co-authors and things like
mhm,
that. It's one thing for me to say, yes, I'm an ally. And then you look at my projects and my work history, and
right,
it's with no Indigenous people.
right,
Right. So obviously, I'm not an actual ally. So, I mean, that's something else that in conversations, again, developing the positionality or relationality statement was
right,
like, prove it.
right.
Right. And it's some of it is through those goals.
Right. And what I'm hearing from what you're saying there is, another important aspect here in terms of developing this is like time. Just you got to be patient because it's not going to happen overnight, right?
No, not even close.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
this was, I will say that and because if you call it a positionality statement or
Mm,
a relationality statement, whatever you call it, this is very much a living document. Every experience, every project that you have may modify this. It
mhm,
may clarify certain aspects of it. And so this has been, this could be like the fourth or fifth iteration that I've had since I just started my PhD
right.
program.
Right.
As a student going through
Uh-huh.
classes and then starting dissertation work, it went through another evolution and,
Yeah.
and things like that. So it's very much a living document. You have to treat it as such, depending on the relationships that you build.
My nerdy brain is like thinking like in the future, like you tracking you're thinking about the data here, tracking like the evolution of these documents and doing like a text analysis through time. It could be really, really interesting.
Well, and it's amazing what you don't catch. For example,
Yeah.
all of my training almost was in these Western fields. It was not from an Indigenous perspective. And
Hmm.
so my first positionality statement was very much from a Western perspective. I did not call myself an ally. I did not do any of that. But it
Right.
was, going back, and it does, as you say, it does show the text analysis of a changing perspective and even your own
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, developing that, you have to go through that process, right? It's a process. Um,
It's going to be uncomfortable, but you still got to do it.
you got to do it.
It's so
Um,
valuable.
right. I just general curiosity, like in terms of kind of work, I don't know how much you've kind of like worked on projects where there's already this kind of data infrastructure or something like that, and you're coming in and saying, saying like, okay, implement things like the CARE principles or anything like that, or principles of data governance, Indigenous data governance, and is there any just kind of regular pushback that you get, or hurdles or obstacles? Is there anything like regular that you kind of see in that work?
Yeah, my favorite pushback is one, we don't get paid to do that.
Ah,
What you do, right?
you do
Um,
actually.
or we don't have the capacity for it.
Mhm.
And my response to that is always one collection at a time. I did one collection that I reviewed per the protocols of Native American archival material. It took me 4 months, and it was a collection of 1,760 glass plate negatives, and it
Uh,
still took me 4 months. So understanding that it's going to take time, but when that collection was done, it was beyond valuable to the communities that were in relationship with it.
right.
And so whenever someone says, we don't have the resources for it, try one collection. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
a big collection. It can be a small collection. Um, and then for others, we don't have the training. We're not comfortable doing it.
Right.
Um, and there's resources out there. That's one of the benefits of compiling these resource lists, right? That there are online trainings that you can take. There are formal trainings even that you can take if you wanted to go that route.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, those are some of the big pushbacks.
Uh-huh.
And some of them are more positive pushbacks in a way because they're literally that I don't know where to start. Right.
Right.
And so having these little steps of, again, take the training, do one
Right.
collection,
Right.
or even reaching out to an Indigenous community on whose land your repository sits,
Right.
right? Something very simple, just start the
Right.
conversation, right? It doesn't have to be this daunting, get a grant for $1 million and
Mhm.
you know what I mean? It doesn't have to
Sure.
be that big.
Right.
So, but yeah, those are some of the pushbacks that I tend to get, or they prioritize researcher, right? Um, how do I prioritize a researcher's needs when information is culturally restricted?
Yeah.
And you missed the point,
Yep.
just a little bit, and
Okay.
in a more positive way, it's like, well, I'm glad you're still asking the question, but still the researcher is not the
Right.
priority in
Right.
this instance when you're talking about cultural protocols and cultural restrictions type thing. So
Right. Right.
those are some of them.
Well, in terms of like kind of like the formal training that you were talking about, are there any resources you could share on that? Like, is it
I
like on
don't have them
websites?
handy. It's
Okay.
because I closed all of my tabs to make sure I
Okay.
didn't have any crazy tabs.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there are some through oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name.
I put you on the spot.
I know. I know.
It's my fault.
There's some through, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but there's some through the Native Nations Institute at the
Okay.
University of Arizona. They will do some cultural sensitivity or cultural sensitivity related.
Great.
If you're affiliated with a university, they generally have, depending on the university, they generally have programs that are cultural sensitivity. Those are like online self-paced
Uh-huh.
rather than like formal quote unquote classroom or something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, those are the more accessible ones that I can think of is through those.
We have a really good question that just came in about can you discuss any principles surrounding data or information destruction?
Are you talking, I'm assuming you're talking about Indigenous data
Yeah,
specifically? Okay.
yeah.
Um, I've had several different conversations around this. So one of the things that I'm doing within my dissertation work is it's never my decision whether or not to destroy compiled data.
Sure.
It is always the community. I have had conversations with representatives from a tribal nation that they're like, nope, we don't want it, destroy it, right? They
Hmm.
don't want it to be extracted. They don't want it to be used to harm the community and current members of community, etc.
Right.
And then there are other conversations that I've had where they're like, no, we just want it.
Yeah.
So we don't want you to destroy it. We just want to make sure that we have the only copy. So
Right.
it's one of those conversational things to where it's community preference when it's their data, because really, even if I've compiled it right within my dissertation, none of it is
Mhm.
actually mine. I don't own any of it. I don't have the rights to any of it. It's all theirs.
Right.
And so it's just that conversation that you have to have. It may be uncomfortable as you start off when they're trying to understand the implications of destruction versus not and things like that. But still, it'll be the community's choice.
Gotcha. Well, Jewel, I think we're going to call it there. I want to be respectful of your time. That was about 15 solid minutes of questions, but we've got a bunch of thank yous rolling in here in the chat. And so we just really appreciate taking your time to talk with us about this important topic.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I enjoyed your questions. They were good questions.
Yeah,
So
thanks.
thank you.
Yeah. I hope you have a really good evening and see you everyone. And remember, no webinar next week, the following week. All right. Thanks again, Jewel.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.